Welcome to everybody who's attending this CACOR Zoom presentation on April the 20th, 2022, and a warm welcome to all those who join us later through our YouTube recording, which will be ready by tomorrow morning. My name is John Hollins. I shall serve as moderator. My first pleasant duty is to ask Ralph Torrey to introduce our speaker today, Anders Hayden. Over to you, Ralph.
Thank you, John. I first encountered Anders through his book, When Green Growth is Not Enough, which was published, I think, about 8 years ago now. And the book included a passage which was critical, constructively critical, of what Anders will probably be referring to as environmental modernism, or the idea that technological fixes and efficiency can close the gap between the unsustainability of our activity and a sustainable pathway. And when he got to the passage on greenhouse gas emissions and energy, he cited my work. And I was flattered that he found my work such a good example of what he felt was either incomplete or wrong-headed approaches to the problem of sustainability, that I immediately reached out to him, because it had been bothering me for a long time, since I first started delving into thinking about sustainable futures. It had been bothering me, a problem which I call the ABC problem. And when those of us who do this kind of analysis, in its bare bones, greenhouse gas emissions, just to zero in on that one particular type of environmental stress, is equal to A times B times C, where A is a certain level of activity, B is the energy consumption per unit of activity, and C are the emissions per unit of energy. Very simple identity. It gets more complicated, obviously, as you apply it. But that's the bare bones of the way that we look at how we can get our emissions down. But we only focus on the B and the C in this field, most of us who work in it. And this goes all the way back to the 1970s, and partly even to the work of Amory Lovins, who I count among my friends and a great mentor of mine. But there was an argument put forward that so large are the opportunities for improving the efficiency of energy use, and so large are the opportunities for switching to emission-free energy sources, that we can put ourselves on a pathway to sustainability by focusing only on the B and the C. And it got to the point where even suggesting that we needed to look at a variation in levels of consumption, the A term, was considered out of bounds. In fact, I remember in 1981, when we were doing the first, what would now be called low carbon scenario analysis for Canada. It was sponsored by what was then called the Department of Energy, Mines and Resources. I was doing the Ontario part of that work. And I asked at the time, I would really like to look at what the effect would be if more Ontarians lived in apartments rather than single family dwellings. And I got immediately shut down. Oh no, that's tampering with the A term. That's too much like social engineering. Don't even go there. Stick to B and C, efficiency and low carbon sources. And I would say that the decarbonization analysis community has a history of focusing way too much only on the B and the C terms, and not facing up to the unsustainability of consumerism itself, and not facing up to the huge gap between levels of wealth in this world, which makes it completely impossible that we will get to sustainability while maintaining the levels of consumption that are characteristic of the rich countries. And so it was actually a great relief to me to read Anders' book and see that we had a leading Canadian academic in this field who was addressing that term, and who was calling to task those of us who were focusing perhaps too much on the technical fix and not enough on the fundamental unsustainability of the pathway that Western consumerism was on. And so it was my pleasure to get to know Anders. We've tried to collaborate with mixed success over the last few years to try and bring together the quantitative analytical field of low emission pathway analysis and the very rich literature which comes from the sufficiency field in which he excels. And it was my pleasure also to suggest that he be a speaker in this Club of Rome series, because I think what he brings to this conversation is a voice which has been too often ignored or too often quiet amongst the din of the technological fix conversation that's been going on over climate change. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce to you my friend and my colleague, Anders Hayden, who will present to us along these themes. Thank you. Anders?
Thank you very much, Ralph, for that kind introduction. And sorry, I'm just, there we go. And I really appreciate that introduction, which I think helps set the background for what I'm talking about today. And I suppose some of the things I might talk about today may seem a step away from what Ralph was just talking about, but actually they're very closely related in terms of what I'm talking about today. Is I think one of the key ideas coming from this sufficiency perspective that's questioning, consumption and production growth, questioning the infinite growth of the economy. And one of the key ideas that it has evolved towards is this concept of the well-being economy. I also just want to mention, I think in that book, I think I also cited you more favorably, at least in some places, Ralph, for some of your pioneering work, which I, going back some years, I think, was some of the first important work to address some of these questions and to start to raise some questions about these, the volumes of consumption, the volumes of production, and how they add to our ecological challenges. Now, I also want to thank the CACOR for the invitation, and specifically Art Hunter, John Hollins, Jean and Dave Doherty for the invitation and the organization of the event today, and perhaps there are others that I've overlooked. And thanks also to everyone who's in attendance virtually. Now, I also just want to mention that the presentation has evolved out of some conversations with Clay De Silva. He's a doctoral candidate at the University of Waterloo. So he's also contributed to the content, although he has a scheduled conflict and isn't able to be with us today. Now, so what I'm going to be talking about is the idea of a well-being economy, which has been gaining adherence around the world. Often in talks like this, the speaker puts forward, what they think to be the solution to our problems. This talk is not going to be entirely like that. I mean, I should clarify that I'm not speaking on behalf of the well-being economy or any organization that promotes it. I did notice that we do have with us today Yannick Baudouin, who does work in this field, and I'm very curious to hear what he has to say and to have to start a conversation about some of these ideas. So I'll just say from the outset, I think that this is a very important concept. I also have some questions about the way it's evolving. I see it as a very important step, but with some potential limitations and some problems to watch out for. And so I'd like to open up a conversation about further steps to move beyond some of those possible limitations. At the same time, I also want to highlight some positive elements of this concept. So just in terms of a brief outline of the talk, we start by talking about why we need a new economic model, then get into looking at the well-being economy. What is it? Who supports it? What inroads has the idea made? What are some of the potential pitfalls and limitations that are becoming evident as governments embrace the concept? What promise does it hold despite those potential pitfalls or limitations? And what would be needed to take a for a well-being economy to have more transformative impacts. In other words, to allow us to make a breakthrough beyond growth. Okay. Now, in this audience, I'm going to guess I don't need to go into a lot of detail on these points, but just we can talk about any of this in more detail in the discussion if you want. But briefly, in terms of why we need a new economic model, starting on the social side, we face a crisis of inequality. There's been growing inequality in the distribution of income in most nations since the 1970s. There are persistent global inequities that remain. There's also a legacy of inequality related to colonial history that we're just beginning to come to terms with as a nation in Canada. I think the COVID pandemic has also helped to make more visible some of the many forms of inequality through the differentiated risks that people have faced, differentiated risk of exposure along lines of social class, which also have clear connections to issues of race and gender. And I think also during the pandemic, we've also seen a very heavy concentration of financial rewards amongst those who are already at the very top of the economic hierarchy. So these issues are important in themselves, but they also represent the context that has to be taken into account for dealing with the next point, which is the need to confront and find solutions to the ecological crisis. Obviously, climate destabilization is the issue that's getting the most attention, the most obvious problem, but it's certainly not the only one that we face. The other core challenges, including a biodiversity crisis and mass extinctions, pollution of various kinds. I mean, it's striking to see, how significant, for example, air pollution remains as a source of, health risks, of deaths, and significant economic costs, even in high-income nations that have, long ago started to try to address the problem. We have more recent issues such as the pollution of microplastics found everywhere from the depths of the ocean to the insides of our bodies. And the point that I'm trying to emphasize here is that even if, and it's a very big if, even if we could avoid the worst of climate change without changing the economic model, through some series of techno fixes, we would still have a system that's unsustainable with regard to other core issues. Okay. Now, due in large part to those issues, there's been an increasing questioning of the neoliberal capitalism that's dominated since the 1970s. And this is, this question exists in the population, but also even it's spread into elite circles, and governments and international organizations are increasingly using terms like inclusive growth and sustainable growth to distinguish from what's been happening in recent decades. But I think there is a question of whether a kinder, gentler form of growth is enough. And I'll come back to that question in a moment. But for now, I just want to say that there's clearly been a growing and widespread realization of the need for economic alternatives. Okay. Now, one of the key factors behind the drive for a new economic model is the clear limits to GDP as a measurement of progress, of national success, well-being, various different ways that we've come to think about GDP. The critique has been well developed. I don't need to go into all the details, but just suffice it to say that it fails to account for many of the most fundamentally important things that either create well-being or detract from well-being. So it doesn't account for inequality of distribution or for environmental damage and issues of unsustainability. At the same time, it doesn't count for some of the positives from non-market activities, household and volunteer work, or the value of ecological services. Okay. Also fails to account for things like the quality of human relationships, which are absolutely fundamental to the quality of our lives. Now, of course, there's actually no reason why it should take into account these things. It was never intended to be a measurement of well-being. So in some ways, these failings are not the fault of GDP per se. It was only ever devised to be a measure of the level of economic activity. The problem is that we've long been using it for a job that it was never intended, and that was to serve as a measure of well-being or progress. Okay? So as a result of these limitations and other limitations, having GDP growth is certainly no guarantee of improved well-being. Far from it. We can, it's not a good reflection at all of levels of well-being. We have other problems in terms of growing social polarization today, various signs of erosion of social capital, levels of trust in society. Different countries, obviously differ on these points. Some of these trends, most obvious, south of the border, for example. There are also issues of economic insecurity, problems like loneliness in the population, a great many issues of this kind that that aren't captured by GDP either. And so we can see phenomena like, for example, from 2005 onwards, the average level of life satisfaction in OECD countries fell by 3%. That was what the OECD Secretary General reported in 2019. That's despite having fairly substantial economic growth over that time, even accounting for the effects of the 2008 financial crisis. Now, these criticisms of GDP have existed for a long time. I think what's new in the last decade or so is the degree to which these limits of GDP are now widely acknowledged, even by many economists, by many governments, by international organizations like the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's played a key role in work on beyond GDP measurement, including its Better Life Index. So just to give a couple of examples illustrating that growing recognition, recently the UN Secretary General stated that GDP fails to account for the incalculable social and environmental damage that may be caused by the pursuit of profit. And in the very recently released IPCC Working Group 3 report, states clearly that GDP is a poor metric of human well-being. Okay. So again, what I want to highlight here is that there's actually some good news in the degree to which the limits of GDP are now being widely recognized, not just by the critics from the outside, but by economists, governments, international agencies. Okay. But there's a bigger question beyond GDP as a measurement, whether it's the right way to measure well-being or progress. And the more fundamental issue is around the pursuit of economic growth as a societal priority. And that gets into a more contentious set of issues. And in his introduction, Ralph touched on some of these points already. But briefly, I think there's been a fair bit of evidence about the limits of the project of decoupling GDP growth from environmental impacts. One way to think of it is that trying to reduce environmental impacts while continually expanding the economy, continually expanding volumes of production and consumption. This is like trying to run up the down escalator. Where the inputs per unit of output, for example, the impact, per unit of output, and the carbon intensity, for example, has to decline as fast as the economic growth rate, just to stand still, let alone to make progress. And if we continue, say, trying to pursue economic growth in the range of 2 to 3% per year, you're looking at the math, we need, really extremely rapid, very unlikely rates of carbon intensity reduction if we're going to meet our climate goals. And similar types of problems exist with that similar problem exists with other types of environmental issues and challenges. Okay. Now we don't have time to go into the details of all the evidence, but briefly, there's been very limited decoupling of GDP and environmental impacts. It's mostly been what's referred to in the literature as relative decoupling. That is, there's lower impacts per unit of output, but that gets outpaced by the fact that output is growing, often at an even more rapid rate. There is some data that allows you to see some degree of absolute decoupling, lower total impacts that exists. For example, there are some countries that are starting to show, declines in absolute levels of greenhouse gas emissions. But even where you see this kind of data, it generally hasn't happened quickly enough to meet environmental goals. So you can refer to this as being, as not amounting to sufficient absolute decoupling. It doesn't go far enough. Okay. And and frankly, even a slowing of GDP growth rates, even if they were positive, but at slower levels, would potentially help us to meet environmental and climate goals. For example, by limiting energy demand, which makes it easier to meet the remaining demand with zero carbon energy sources. Now, there are also a variety of reasons, and they aren't only ecological reasons, why we can't count on continued long-term economic growth. There's been a debate in recent years over the phenomenon of secular stagnation. So is this really happening, and what are the reasons for it? But there are arguments that we're facing long-term slowdowns in productivity growth with aging populations, among other reasons that are leading to slowdown of growth over time in the higher income nations. And so the upshot of this is that apart from the ecological issues of moving beyond growth, there are reasons why it makes sense to try to figure out how we can manage without growth, to paraphrase the title of Peter Victor's book on these issues. Okay, now I left a few dots there on that slide just to indicate that maybe we could add other points to this list on why we need a new economic model. Okay, but that brings us thinking about one of the main proposals for an alternative model, and that's the idea of a well-being economy. And there's no one way to describe a well-being economy, and there's a great many formulations and attempts to sum it up. So I'll share a few with you that have stood out to me. And these are descriptions that come from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, the main group promoting the concept. And so one formulation is that a well-being economy is one that serves people and planet. It doesn't focus on growth in economic terms, but instead growth in human well-being, flourishing, environmental quality, which are more important than just money. Another formulation is that it's a different economic system, which prioritizes the well-being of people and the planet. At the moment, we're chasing economic growth that is destroying the planet without delivering what we really need as humans. A well-being economy is aimed at changing this and delivering what we need the first time around. And so a third formulation, building a well-being economy, is about transforming our economic system so that it delivers social justice on a healthy planet. Now, as I said, there are many other phrases that have been put forward to capture the idea of a well-being economy, but those are a few that stood out to me. Now, it's clear that many of the people that are behind this idea bring with them a critical perspective on economic growth and the growth paradigm. A number of the key players in the well-being economy movement recently published this article, which has argued that the well-being economy concept is the most effective way to bring post-growth ideas and policies into the mainstream. It's also interesting, in terms of historical connections, many of these people behind the well-being economy movement have a connection to the International Expert Working Group that was convened by Bhutan back in 2012 to develop and promote a new economic paradigm. And in fact, there are some strong parallels between a vision of a well-being economy and Bhutan's vision and approach towards gross national happiness. Okay. Now, so many of the people, in fact, most of the people who've been promoting this concept from the beginning have a critical perspective on growth. That said, in some hands, this idea has taken a more pro-growth turn. So the Secretary General of the OECD a couple of years ago stated that the economy of well-being highlights the need for putting people at the center of policy and moving away from an attitude of grow first, redistribute, and clean up later towards a growth model that is equitable and sustainable from the outset. Okay. So this is really a slightly different formulation that's not really about moving beyond growth, but trying to have a different, more equitable, more sustainable growth model, what I referred to as a vision of kinder, gentler growth. And in fact, these more pro-growth interpretations, I think, are becoming more evident as the concept is being adopted by governments and mainstream economic institutions. And I think we'll come back to that later in terms of these different interpretations and and the implications of them. Now, first I want to say a little bit more about who's been supporting the idea. A partial list needs to start with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which I mentioned briefly earlier. This is they describe themselves as a global collaboration of almost 200 organizations, alliances, movements, and individuals working together to transform the economic system into one that delivers on 5 core needs for ecological and human well-being: dignity, connection, nature, fairness, and participation. So that description also gives you another angle on what a well-being economy aims to achieve and aims to prioritize. If you go online, follow that link, you can see all the lists of organizations behind it. Behind this idea, there are a lot of ecologically minded civil society organizations, and in fact, the Club of Rome is a member of this alliance. Perhaps many of you were aware of this already, but maybe not. In any case, there's also a network trying to build support for a well-being economy in Canada, known as the Wellbeing Economies Alliance for Canada and Sovereign Indigenous Nations, hosted by the David Suzuki Foundation. And I hope in the discussion we can hear from Yannick Baudouin, who represents that organization, and I'm sure has a lot to say on these issues. Okay. Now, one of the most significant developments, perhaps the most significant development, is the emergence of the well-being economy governments. So there are at present 5 governments that have committed to a well-being economy. That's New Zealand, Scotland, Iceland, Wales, and Finland. And this network states that its aims are to deepen their understanding and advance the shared ambition of building well-being economies. This grouping has been likened to something like an alternative to the G7. It's one that's trying to promote expertise, share best practice and policy ideas to try to move towards this common ambition of a well-being economy. Now, I'll just also briefly mention that Canada has expressed some preliminary and some limited interest. There have been some Canadian observers at some past meetings, but certainly no formal involvement in this network yet. Okay. Now, an economy of well-being has also been endorsed by organizations that include the OECD, the Council of the European Union, the European Economic and Social Committee, and maybe other organizations that one can add to this list. But overall, I think we can see something that's fairly significant here, in that there are significant inroads into the political mainstream for a concept that emerged out of a critical perspective on economic growth. And that actually has been one of the main arguments that some of the proponents have made for it, that this concept has a capacity to appeal to a broad range of people, including some of those with power, and it has a type of appeal in the mainstream that other concepts that are critical of the growth paradigm so far have not had. At least that's one of the key arguments that the proponents make. Okay, now I want to shift towards looking at what some of these well-being economy governments have done, and some of the things that they've said, starting with one that's probably got the most attention, and that's New Zealand. And so one of the key steps for these well-being economies is to have an alternative measurement framework that goes beyond GDP as the dominant indicator of well-being. So in New Zealand, they have a living standards framework to guide policy. It's a dashboard of 38 different indicators, covers 12 domains of current well-being. And there are many measurement approaches of this kind that are emerging, but they often are similar in terms of covering similar domains, having measurements to look at things like, in New Zealand's case, civic engagement and governance, cultural identity, environment, health, housing, income and consumption, and so on, so forth. Also subjective well-being, asking people how they perceive, their quality of their lives and their life satisfaction is also becoming an increasingly important indicator. Now, in New Zealand's case, they also have indicators for 4 forms of capital: natural, human, social, financial, and physical, in order to assess sustainability into the future. And I think what's even more important than these measurements in New Zealand, in fact, a lot of countries are moving towards different measurement frameworks of this type, And that's all very good and nice, but what's important is actually not just measuring these things, but actually doing something with these measurements and actually bringing them into the policy, into policy making, which is certainly not guaranteed. Just having the information, it doesn't necessarily generate much in the way of impact. But in New Zealand's case, they have integrated this measurement framework into the budget making process. So it's a key way of bringing these new well-being measurements into policy making starting in 2019. And so the information from that Living Standards Framework dashboard was a key source of the information used to set 5 priorities for budget making. Those happen to be mental health, child well-being, supporting Indigenous people, moving into the digital age through innovation, and the transition to a sustainable low emissions economy. And I think one of the interesting things about the process that has evolved in New Zealand, in the words of Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, if you're a minister and you want to spend money, you have to prove that you're going to improve intergenerational well-being. So in the lead up to the budget and departments trying to make their claims for additional funding, they had to show how their expenditures aligned with the 5 priorities and refer to the well-being impacts of their initiatives. One of the other things that hasn't got a lot of attention, but what strikes me as quite innovative, is if you look at their budget document, right at the beginning, it starts with a well-being outlook for the nation, and that includes an assessment of key sustainability issues and challenges. That's right at the beginning of the budget, outlining the challenges that the government needs to face, and that's in addition to and going beyond a conventional economic outlook. So I think it signals that there's a different approach at play now. Now in Scotland, just briefly, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has stated that Scotland's redefining what it means to be a successful country and putting well-being at the heart of what we're doing. She's stated that GDP cannot be the only measure of national progress, and Scotland also has its own dashboard to guide policy, its national performance framework. Okay. Iceland similarly has a new framework of indicators that assesses well-being according to various social, economic, and environmental factors. One of the things that's notable about Iceland as a country is that it ranks #1 in the world on gender equality, according to the Global Gender Gap report. It has a feminist ecologist prime minister, Katrin Jakobsdottir, and she represents a party known as the Left Green movement. And she's spoken of the need to develop a new economic model which is centered on well-being rather than on production and consumption. That's a slightly more radical framing from a well-being economy government leader. Goes a little bit further than others towards explicitly questioning production and consumption growth. Okay? And so the Prime Minister has expressed commitment to supporting strong Nordic welfare state and greater climate action in line with Green New Deal thinking. Okay? Now in Wales, again, they also have their own new measurement framework. Now also has introduced what's potentially innovative legislation that embeds these different goals and different measurements into policy making. I say potentially innovative because the jury is still out on how much impact a lot of these developments are going to have over the long term. But in any case, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales requires ministers and government bodies to work towards 7 well-being goals, and in effect establishing a legally binding common purpose. And that word, I think, common purpose, is interesting and important. There's been a lot of discussion and criticism about how government departments tend to work in silos, often even working at cross purposes at times. And certainly one of the hopes for a well-being agenda is they can break down these silos and create a shared overarching goal of well-being, sustainable well-being. Okay. And then finally, briefly, Finland has also committed to an economy of well-being, with the goal of economic policy being to increase well-being. You can see that reflected in budgetary priorities in recent years, with greater emphasis, with priorities including greater equality and climate action. And I think one of the noteworthy things about Finland is, it comes at the top or near the top of a number of different global indices. And perhaps the most notable is it's been ranked year after year in recent years as the happiest country in the world, according to World Happiness Report. So it's noteworthy having this country on board with in the Wellbeing Economy government's network. Now, from the images on those past few slides, you might have noticed something about the leaders in these countries. It's not an absolute requirement to be female to appreciate the value of a well-being economy, but apparently it increases the likelihood. I should point out that the First Minister of Wales, who did take the country into the Wellbeing Economy Government's Alliance, is a man, but it seems unlikely to be a coincidence that the other 4 countries are governed by women. Okay. So I think, in summary, these Wellbeing Economy government countries, they're pioneers that are exploring what it means to make well-being, and I like to emphasize sustainable well-being as the core goal, measured by indicators other than GDP. But I think it's also important to note that none of these countries has actually said that they're no longer pursuing GDP growth. It's been a more subtle shift. Economic growth is no longer their core goal, but if you dig into the statements, they're still saying they're pursuing GDP growth as one means amongst others to achieve the ultimate end goal of well-being. So take, for example, the Scottish government, which says it seeks to deliver well-being through sustainable and inclusive economic growth. Now, how much of a change is that in practice? I think it's still early to tell. I think we can maybe have some discussion about how much of a change this really represents. Something I'd like to hope we can talk about in the discussion period. Now, before that, I want to talk a little bit about some of the related pitfalls that could mean that this may not necessarily amount to a lot of change. But then I also want to talk about emphasize some of the positive potential that I do think exists for this well-being economy framing, and some of the ways that it might be bolstered to have more transformative post-growth impacts. Okay. Now, in terms of the pitfalls or limitations, there's clearly a danger of watering down the concept as it moves into the mainstream. It's pretty hard to be against well-being. Almost everybody's going to be in favor of well-being, but being in favor of well-being or a well-being economy can mean a lot of different things. And so when we see others accepting this idea, buying into the idea of a well-being economy, we can't necessarily assume that they understand it in the same way that we do. And so there's been an error that's obvious that stood out to me amongst people who are assuming that as governments adopt the well-being economy language, that they're also embracing the full range of post-growth ambitions that have been the motivation behind those who originally developed the concept. And so this error is evident in some of the writing and advocacy about the well-being economy. And so, again, we can't assume that governments are buying and accepting the whole post-growth package when they're accepting this language and committing to these concepts. Okay? Certainly the governments that have moved in this direction haven't yet gone that far in their understanding, at least not yet. And that leads to the next point and a concern that I have is the way a risk that the well-being economy language could be co-opted to serve existing agendas. And I gave one example earlier, an even stronger example can be seen in this statement from the Council of the European Union, which wrote that while people's well-being is a value in itself, the economy of well-being underlines the mutually reinforcing nature of well-being and economic growth. Taking well-being into account in all policies is vitally important to the Union's economic growth, productivity, long-term fiscal sustainability, and social stability. So what we see here is, rather than a challenge to the growth paradigm, in a formulation like this, well-being is valued, at least in large part, because it's seen to contribute to economic growth and the continued expansion of the economy. Okay. Now, one other thing to keep in mind is that even those who want to go further than that, even those that have more transformative post-growth aspirations, might struggle to achieve them in a context, and we'll have difficulties in achieving them in a context where we still have a high degree of growth dependency. Okay, and so and that's a key reason why, even for these well-being economy countries, even though they're saying they're moving beyond economic growth as the core goal, they're still relying on it as a means to the end of well-being. So governments are still reliant on economic expansion to maintain high employment levels, to generate tax revenues for social spending, and these are things that are key contributors, to well-being. And so think about somebody like Katrín Jakobsdóttir in Iceland, who seems to have a fairly progressive, even radical perspective on these issues. She still has to manage the Icelandic state and generate revenues for its activities and social spending. And so, a great deal of that still is heavily dependent to this point on economic growth. Okay. So another way to state this problem is that declaring that economic growth is no longer the end goal doesn't in itself reduce dependence on growth. And this is still a core challenge that we have to wrestle with. Even if we can get a commitment to change the end goal to well-being or sustainable well-being. Now, a related issue is that some growth critics, some advocates of a steady state economy, think a well-being economy doesn't go far enough in challenging the growth paradigm, that it shifts the focus to well-being, but doesn't explicitly or directly put limits on the scale of the economy or on material throughput. So some would argue that those issues need to be more directly targeted. Okay. Now, well, I'll mention one other related set of issues with regard to potential pitfalls or limitations. In the well-being economy discourse, the focus on well-being generally tends to, goes alongside a discussion of sustainability, but there are tensions between these goals. High well-being today can certainly come at the expense of well-being tomorrow or at the expense of others globally. And in fact, I think that's a pretty good summary of the situation in many high-income nations today. There was a study a few years ago by O'Neill and colleagues found that countries that have done well in surpassing the social thresholds to provide good lives for their people, the countries that have done the most in terms of generating well-being for their populations, including high levels of life satisfaction. These have also been the countries that have transgressed the greatest number of physical boundaries. And so biophysical boundaries or planetary boundaries. So this focus on well-being as the end goal, it's important that it doesn't lose sight of the need to.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, so in terms of the emphasis on well-being. I mean, it needs to be about living well, but we can't lose sight of it needing to be living well within planetary boundaries. And I think a related concern is that ecological sustainability may be only weakly incorporated into some of these well-being measurement frameworks. And this is something to watch out for. And this is a particular concern that I have in Canada. I mentioned that there have been some tentative steps in the direction of a well-being economy in Canada. One of them was the introduction last year of a draft quality of life measurement framework by the federal government. It has some positive elements to it, for sure, as far as it goes. But it also does relatively very little to illustrate our globally unsustainable impacts. For example, it doesn't have data for material, carbon, or ecological footprint measures. I mean, it does have greenhouse gas emissions data, but I think ideally what we should have, as some other countries do in their well-being indicator sets, is data on material, carbon, ecological footprints, alongside with that, the best scientific estimates of what a per capita level consistent with planetary boundaries would be. So the concern that I have here is that making sure that our well-being and sustainability indicators don't push under the rug some of the more problematic data. Okay. Now, I've touched on some of the pitfalls, the potential limitations, but I definitely don't want to lose sight of the positive potential for the well-being economy concept. I mean, at the very least, it represents an important advance over neoliberal economics. even if in the end it doesn't turn out to be everything that some people might hope for, even if it doesn't end up being the breakthrough beyond growth in itself, it does certainly highlight a key role for governments in ensuring equitable distribution, access to well-being enhancing services, and more action to address sustainability challenges. So if all it does is give a boost to more, social democratic policies with some more climate action, it's a step forward in my view. But beyond that, I think establishing sustainable and equitable well-being as the overarching goals, and downplaying the centrality of GDP and economic growth, I think this is an important step in a post-growth direction, even if growth is still being pursued as a means to achieve well-being. And it is an important step that I think may now be within reach as a result of the well-being economy concept. Okay? Now, one other important benefit, I think, of the well-being economy as a framing is that it draws attention to thinking about the factors that contribute most to well-being. And many of those are not about material consumption. So there's been a lot of work in recent years that's been done on building up the evidence base about the determinants of well-being. A lot of interesting findings. So for example, there's evidence showing that enhancing a sense of social belonging, mutual support, and trust, that these things have greater potential to enhance our well-being and are also more environmentally sustainable than increased material consumption. Okay? So I think a well-being economy has the potential to expand our understanding of the sources of well-being and open up space for a wider debate about where, as individuals and as a society, we ought to put our efforts in terms of achieving better lives, and that there are some important options to do that in less materially intensive ways. Okay? I think the well-being economy's emphasis on preventing social and ecological damage rather than repairing it at great cost is also a very positive contribution. That's a theme that's quite prominent in some of the well-being economy literature. So for example, by investing in measures that support people's health and well-being, on the front end, so that they don't need, expensive public services such as healthcare afterwards. I think this is something that's, on the one hand, potentially appealing to governments, but also has an important connection to post-growth thinking, because it can help reduce the need for costly public spending as a way to reduce growth. As a way to reduce dependency on growth. And this is an important point that I'll come back to in a moment. Okay. Now, just one other positive thing to highlight. The critics of the status quo often end up being defined by what they're against, being against the growth paradigm, for example, and that criticism certainly can be important. But beyond that, I think a well-being economy is a valid goal in itself, and it's a positive answer to the question of what one is for. Okay. Now, perhaps other people, there's other things that we could add to this list, which maybe we could talk about in discussion. But I want to say a few things about the way forward. I put a question mark there because I think it's something we can debate and discuss. Drawing on the work of Tim Jackson, an important post-growth thinker, I think we can think in terms of a three-step approach. First, introducing beyond GDP indicators to guide policy. And so well-being economy governments are doing this now. We need to find ways to embed those new indicators into policy making, policy that prioritizes sustainable well-being, and well-being economy governments are starting to do this. And there's also a third point that I think we need to better understand and find solutions to growth dependency. And this is a big, challenging task that remains. As the European Economic and Social Committee stated recently, that a well-being economy must start by adopting a precautionary approach in which macroeconomic stability does not depend on GDP growth. Now that's a big challenge, and that's not something we can simply that can simply be declared by saying we're in favor of a well-being economy. Like I said, it's a very complicated challenge, and with regard to that, someone like Tim Jackson has called for an inquiry into the growth dependency of the UK economy, and has led some important work in this area. So I think much more work is needed on this set of issues about understanding the ways in which the economy still remains dependent on growth and figuring out how we can disentangle ourselves from that dependence. So there's a lot more research that's needed and also policy that's needed in that area. Now, with that in mind, I think that well-being economy policies that actually target and aim to reduce growth dependency would be particularly valuable. And so that there's a lot of different issues that arise here, but certainly policies that maintain employment and economic and social security in a post-growth society are particularly important in breaking down growth dependency. A number of ideas have been put forward in order to think about how we can become less reliant on growth to meet these needs. Ideas such as work time reduction, the proposals for a job guarantee, for basic income, universal basic services. So whatever the solutions that and the policies that are adopted in these areas, I think it's particularly important that well-being economy governments start to wrestle with them. Another related set of issues that's, I think, extremely important is finding ways to achieve greater equity in asset ownership, whether that's through expansion of the cooperative economy or municipal and state ownership, or the growth of sovereign wealth funds, a variety of possibilities. But we do need measures, I think, to ensure that, we need measures to ensure that individuals, communities, and states have access to the revenues that they need to meet core needs. And this is going to be particularly important in a context in which the overall size of the economy, the overall pie, is not growing in the same way as in the past. So, so again, I think that, the well-being economy governments, if they can address and wrestle with these issues, they can, I think, make a very significant contribution. Now, one other issue that I touched on briefly earlier is around preventative policies in areas like health promotion that reduce the need for costly public expenditure for remedial services. These are also particularly important in terms of reducing state revenue needs. And I think that's an important piece of the agenda of reducing growth dependency. Okay. Now, I also think it's important that we use this debate around the well-being economy to push for policies that reflect the idea of sufficiency, concept that came up at the beginning, an idea of ensuring that all have enough for core needs while limiting excess consumption. Of course, we can debate what it means to have excess consumption, but in any case, these ideas of sufficiency have long been kept on the sidelines. As Ralph pointed out in the introduction, governments tend to focus on environmental solutions that are based on greener technologies, greater ecological efficiency, without addressing the question of how much is enough in terms of levels of consumption. And I think certainly, replacing GDP growth as the overarching goal should definitely open up more space for solutions that are based on consuming less. Whether that's policies such as work time reduction policies that give people pay increases in the form of more time rather than higher incomes and consumption, or promotion of a repair society and more durable goods, which including things like a right to repair, but going further than that in terms of normalizing the idea of repair and reuse of goods rather than disposal. I think there's extremely important policies related to urban planning, emphasizing active and public transportation, enabling people to live well and meet their needs within short distances. And we've seen more discussion in recent years around concepts like a 15-minute city. Policies like restrictions on advertising of the most carbon-intensive goods and services. So things like restricting advertising for SUVs or air travel. In my opinion, these are policies that ought to be kind of no-brainers in a context where we've recognized that we're in a climate emergency, but we still don't seem to be acting like we're taking the emergency so seriously. Okay. Well, there are many other policies that could be added to the list here in terms of sufficiency-oriented policies that could be supported and enabled by this discussion around the move towards a well-being economy. Now, just going to jump ahead to conclude. And so I think that this concept of a well-being economy, I think it has very considerable potential to contribute to improving quality of life, to generating better policy making that aims to increase well-being, by highlighting the need for policies that promote well-being, that address inequalities of various kinds, and that also address sustainability. It's at the very least an important step beyond the neoliberal model based on so-called free markets that has dominated in recent years. Now, I think that we can consider this idea of a well-being economy to be an important transitional step, but I do think it needs to be pushed further if it's going to contribute to post-growth transformation. And in particular, I think there's a need to wrestle with and try to find solutions to some of these problems of growth dependency that even well-being economies face. So in short, I think it's a valuable idea to engage with and to do so both supportively and critically. And I'm curious to hear what you all have to think about it. So I'm going to stop here.
Well, thank you very much, Anders, for broadening our perspective here. There are many aspects. This is as complex an issue as all the technical stuff. And so those of us who are immersed in the technical stuff appreciate the broadening. Now, Peter McKinnon, if you will kindly turn your mic on and turn your video on, I'll invite you to make the first observation or ask the first question here. Peter?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, John. I cannot turn my video on because it's still controlled by the host. I can ask my question or we can go without the video.
No, go ahead.
Oh, there we go. Oops. There we are. Yes, okay. Thank you very much for the floor. Professor Hayden, thank you for your presentation. I found it really fascinating. Just as background, I do a lot of work in smart cities and the environments around them. So my questions are going to relate to that, and you've touched on it a little bit. In fact, I was in your chair, so to speak, just a few weeks ago at CACOR. So my question really relates to a few things I didn't hear. One was I didn't hear anything about the UN development goals, and there are much more than just GDP stuff. So I just wondered if you might, I don't need a comment on that, but I got to get to my main point. I didn't hear much also about, or anything really about, in effect, basic income, although you mentioned it just a few moments ago. But my real question focuses on the circular economy. And I'm just wondering, does the concept of the circular economy fit into your well-being or economy of well-being? Could it be a bridge to that economy of well-being? You just mentioned maybe the economy of well-being is a bridge to something, but I'm not sure what that bridge is. So that's my question relates to the circular economy and how does that fit, if it does, into your story, because some of the discussion was challenging whether it was that kind of an economic model. Circular economy is about making money in GDP, or is it about other things? And I consider circular economy as a broader set of some of the things you talked about. Thank you for your comment.
Sure. Okay. Should I take these questions one at a time, or? Yes,
go ahead. We'll have a conversation.
Sure. So with regard to circular economy, I think I think there's some strong complementarity, strong affinity with both the well-being economy concept and I think the idea of a circular economy actually works better in a post-growth context than a growth-oriented context. I think a circular economy, I don't claim expertise in the issue, but the way I see the question is that it's a valuable concept to try to in a variety of ways to try to push for much greater efficiencies. It also creates some openings for some of these concepts, like a focus on repair, a focus on reuse, that kind of go beyond the conventional growth thinking. So it opens up some space for those ideas. I think if we're still stuck in a model of infinite expansion of the economy, that undermines in important ways the benefits of a circular economy. I mean, you can't get to perfect circularity in any case, but the more that the economy is growing, the more that you're going to have to be bringing new materials into the system, in addition to additional energy to feed, for the system to function. So I think the benefits of a circular economy are more substantial in a post-growth setting. So I guess that's how I see that circular economy connecting to some of these issues.
Okay, thank you for your comments.
Thank you. Following an intervention by Ted Manning, I shall be going to Yannick Baudouin. Ted.
Anders, that was very good. And I come from sustainable development, not economics. So I'm going to ask a couple of heretical questions. Do we want to change economics, or do we want to replace it? And secondly, I've worked for many years in Canada and in UN agencies to try and replace economic measures with a very broad range of indicators, through including the ones for the new goals. Is this going to work? Are there in fact indicators that people will salute as much as they do GDP?
Yeah. Okay. To change or replace economics? Good question. I mean, I'm guessing that you have a particular meaning behind that, or what's motivating that question.
No, I just don't think that one discipline has all the answers, and I would like them to work together.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable statement. I mean, look, I think there are a lot of good people doing work within economics, broadly defined. I think conventional economics, I think, has been deeply problematic in a lot of ways, but
yeah,
there are some valuable concepts that have emerged from it, and people certainly working on the more critical edges of it, and the sort of the heterodox approaches, the ecological economics, and so on, that have engaged critically with economics, have some valuable ideas to bring to it. So in terms of the indicators that can, basically, will anything have if I can rephrase the question, if you ask, well, can anything have as much resonance as GDP?
Yeah, that's correct.
I guess it's a good. It's a good question. I mean, one of the challenges in this debate is, there's a tension between wanting to come up with a single number that can rival and challenge GDP, and so there've been attempts to come up with things like, we have a Canadian Index of Wellbeing that can produce, a different number, and there's communication advantages to kind of come up with that other single number. But there's also a problem, is that when you group everything together, it kind of does violence to reality in some important ways, and you come up with these fairly, these numbers that are aggregated in ways that are inevitably questionable. There's weightings of the different components that are questionable. So there has been a general move, I think, more towards a dashboard approach, multiple indicators. And I think that there are definite advantages to the dashboards in terms of having a better understanding of the multiple different dimensions of well-being and sustainability. The drawback is you can end up with so many different numbers that they don't get the same attention, they don't have the same resonance. So that's a tension that I'm not sure anyone's fully worked through. I think one of the proposals that might be a good way to think about it is having a limited set of core headline indicators that, behind which there's a bigger dashboard of indicators, but you have a limited set of a few priority indicators that could challenge and draw more attention and rival GDP, but behind which you need a more nuanced and a more nuanced data and a wider range of data.
Agree completely with you. I can send you a book where we tried to do that. I'm not sure we got there, but thank you.
I'd be happy to see that, actually.
Okay.
Thank you. Yannick Baudouin is next on the floor, and then I'm going to go to Zach. Yannick, please.
I think I was surprised to be put on the spotlight here, but thanks, Anders, for this. Maybe I'll turn my comment into a question, so it actually goes into a question. But I think what was nice about your talk too is it's very good to sort of help highlight and summarize how easy the technical solutions, the knowledge base, we have all the knowledge, we have all the indicators, everything, all that part is quite present, and probably the 21st century, first time in modern times where we have all the abilities, knowledge and technology not to be doing the destructive and unequal and harmful things that we do. And so then to us in the We All Can, when we mapped that out about 2 years ago, we're trying to figure out, okay, do we go down those paths? Do we do more modeling? Do we try to figure out indicators again? Or do we go down maybe the more obscure path, right? Where the faith-based pieces, the myths and assumptions that the Western economic worldview still holds so dear. And so we've decided not to go with the easy and go more with that obscure. So in a way, maybe the question back would be, if you make that assumption that we have all the technology, we have all the technical know-how, we have all the knowledge base and science base and all the data to show us, the right ways, what's missing then? What do you feel is that the part of the equation that is rarely or not looked at or somehow just not addressed?
That's a really good question. I'm trying to buy time to think of an answer. But I'm going to guess that you've given some. Can I put you on the spot? Because I'm suspecting. I mean, in a way, I feel like you could have been on the stage here giving this talk as well today, and in terms of the work that you've done with We All Canada. I don't know where. Yeah, can I put you on the spot and ask you where you've gotten to it?
Sure. Well, maybe I'll just give a anecdote. I did a play on words there. So we have been working a lot with Finance Ministry and Treasury Board as they're rolling out and building up the quality of life framework. And what was interesting in the insights and the conversations off the record, and if you look in budget 2022, book 2, you see the whole, everything that New Zealand puts on the front page, Canada puts on the back page. But it's all in there, right? And so what our wonderful contact there was telling us is like, look, all of that's there. The scorecarding is done, the point system, the whole thing around quality of life, it's not perfect or whatever. So everything technical is there. Has it shifted the psychology of decision-making? Absolutely not. Not one iota. And her feeling was primarily fear of the unknown, fear of the non-familiar. So it's easy and familiar following GDP and doing your accounting. If you're asked to start to consider something else, there's a fear of obviously political risk and all those things. So maybe for us, that's a bit of an indication. All right, how do we help work with fear, with anxiety at the decision-making level? With Quebec just did a whole thing on 51 well-being indicators. The first thing the journalists asked them is, okay, well, right now we have one number. How do you think people are going to react to 51? Totally point, right? The fear again and the anxiety of the unfamiliar. So I think there's an element there that we're trying to help create spaces where letting go and sunsetting some of the old, and also realizing that this is not about creating a new economic model. It really is about replacing something that's pretty young with things that were a lot older, outside of the current worldview, existing for far, far longer. And how do you inspire that? How do you start to find solutions that are not part of the dominating worldview as well? So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, well, I find it's interesting what you say about some of this work that's happening in Canada, that it's similar to what's happening in New Zealand, but it's all at the back and it's hidden, and it's been really striking that like New Zealand, you have the Prime Minister making statements. As I said, you got it at the front of the budget document, and if you look at the Canadian government documents, I mean, the Finance Minister doesn't say a word about it. There's nothing in the press release. There's nothing in the budget speech. I'm glad you told me that there's a book 2, because I looked in book 1 in the recent budget. I didn't even see where some of the stuff that had been in last year's budget was. So there's definitely some real reluctance at the federal government to engage publicly with this. I think you're right to point at the fear of the political risk, and I think there's probably a lot of fear about it being attacked politically as being sort of something soft and woolly and fluffy, and Justin going on about something unrealistic or something along those lines. You can imagine what the conservatives doing their worst with it and going after the government over it. So I think that I think that is part of what's holding government back.
Thank you. I want to let everybody know that I'm primarily following the chat list, but I'll come to you, and a couple of people have put up hands. I'll come to you, Julia, Kim, in a bit. I've got you in roughly the right order. So next we have two members who basically made the same point. So I'm going to go first of all to Zach Jacobson and Mike Nickerson. I'll come to you following Zach to ask your second question. Zach, please.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for the talk. Look, I'm going to make a confession. I'm the kind of guy whose eyes glaze over every time I hear a talk that's got the word economics in the title, whether it's circular economics or well-being economics or even economics. So yeah, I can appreciate the idea of, can we call this anything else? However, that said, yeah, I'm one of the guys that said, no, I don't think that's a coincidence that all of or most of the people you mentioned at first are countries with female prime ministers. However, if I can just shoot a small hole in my own question, they're small countries as well, at least small in the economic sense, and not necessarily the cultural sense. And in fact, quite the contrary, Scotland, Iceland, Anyway, but if you put large nations, large economies that have had female prime ministers, India, Germany, the country, the record is a little more spotty. So maybe there's also an interaction with the size of the nation. That was really more of a comment, but I'd love to hear your comment on it.
Sure. I think there's something to it. I'm just on the first part. I mean, I don't know. I mean, some people are referring to a well-being society as opposed to a well-being economy. I don't know if that addresses your objection about glazing over when you hear talk of economics, but I think
it would help me a hell of a lot.
So on the second issue about the size of the countries, I think that's definitely an important observation. I think with these types of issues, I actually think some of the most interesting innovation is likely to happen first in some of the smaller places, a little bit more on the margins, the countries that aren't aspiring to be the biggest power in the world or the biggest power in their block and part of the world, as measured in a conventional sense. So I think it's no coincidence that some of these smaller countries. I mean, Bhutan is another example of a real innovator. A small countries like Costa Rica.
Not really protected rights.
So thank you. Mike Nickerson, you're on, please. And following Mike, I'm going to turn to Jean or Dave Doherty. Mike.
Okay, well, I want to thank you, Anders, for your talk. I usually come on and I encourage people to look at the social factors and the way we could shift our culture to reduce consumption, and you're all over that, and that's wonderful. I like that Ralph calls that area of concern A in the list of items of concern. So I'll remember that. And I'll just thank you again. And this is the catchphrase here.
Yeah.
Take care. Thank you.
Nice to see you, Mike.
So more fun, less stuff. That's great. So is it Jean or David Doherty who has a question to put?
Yeah, it's Dave. Hi. So I recently found out about something called the Venus Project, I'm not sure whether you're aware of it, but it seems that it's in line with what you're discussing with the well-being economy. And I was wondering if you had any comments about the ideals behind that project. I don't know much about the project yet, still trying to learn about it because it's a very detailed website.
Sorry, I'm afraid I'm not aware of it. So I'll have to rely on you to fill us in to the extent that you can.
Well, I can't tell you a whole bunch more because I just found out about it. However, I did put in the chat a link to it. It's easy to find on the internet, the Venus Project. It seems to be essentially focusing on a different type of organization for society that doesn't rely on, you know, growth and money and all the things that we currently focus.
Well, from what you say, it sounds like something that has an affinity with what we're talking about here. So I definitely have to look into that before I can say more.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Peter Bolkowski, can you unmute and ask your question, please? If not,
well, yeah. Okay. The we is a very interesting concept. How do you see a we country interacting with foreign or international issues where there are clearly still human beings who are not all saints? We have the Russian attempt at recolonization of Ukraine. So how do you see we countries interacting internationally when you have such rogue players, and those rogue players represent more than half the population of the world?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. It strikes me personally. I mean, I'm Ukrainian myself in terms of my family background. You wouldn't know from my name, but both my mother and father sides of the family are from Ukraine. So yeah, I mean, so what does well-being mean to people of Ukraine today? And you know, I've always been, you know, critical of militaries and military spending, and seeing that those resources are better used in other purposes, and I still hold that as an ideal. But certainly today, what people in Ukraine need is some weapons to get the Russians out of their country. In that very extreme, brutalized context, you know, well-being can't be achieved, created, restored until you fight the invader and get them out of your country. So in the world that we live in, well-being still depends on, you know, some level of military spending. In higher conflict zones, that's going to require regrettably more military spending. I think that to the extent that we can keep those military budgets to a minimum possible, that enables more resources to devote to other, you know, to more direct ways of achieving well-being. But yeah, there is a real world that we're in, and as I said, it's a very personal issue for me because you know, I have family members fighting for the Ukrainian armed forces, and you know, and I think we, you know, I personally, you know, want to support what they need to do right now.
So if I go back to my question though, you have other countries that are heading towards we, okay, be it Iceland or Scotland or wherever. How do you see those countries having their national policies, their spending priorities, their international actions to deal with that rather sometimes nasty world out there?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's going to come down to a case-by-case basis. I mean, look, Finland is a member of the Wellbeing Economy Governments Alliance, and you know, led by Prime Minister Marin. You saw the image on the slide, and you know, and she is now proposing to take Finland into NATO after, you know, all these years. So again, that's a kind of concrete example of a specific policy decision that you know, might not be the kind of ideal situation that a well-being economy government would like to be dealing with, but you know, that's making a decision like that does not necessarily or in itself run counter to the idea of pursuing a well-being economy. It's more of a regrettable response to a far from perfect world.
Right. Thank you for your answers.
Mary, please unmute your microphone, and I'll just remind people that we've used about 80 of our 90 minutes for the recorded part of this. I've got Julia Kim up next, and I'm coming back to Ralph and possibly Yannick. Mary, please go ahead.
Hi, Anders. I'm Mary Hegan from Ottawa, and I'm well within your bubble. Everything you've said, I applaud. But I'm right back to the question Zach came up with, and I really want to know why the Wellbeing Alliance uses the word economy. I think for a lot of us, certainly maybe the Americas and North America, it just confuses the direction you're going and where you want to put the priorities. And I'll be a little specific. I'm personally working with groups on nature-based solutions to the climate crisis. And it's all very soft and sweet and nice, but it doesn't go anywhere when it gets to policy making and the mixing of our sectors, because it's very hard to put a dollar amount on how we want to get there and what the deliverable is, and so it's just dismissed. So it gets back to the basic definition in the dictionary of economy, and wondered why you're using that term.
Well, just to clarify, I mean, I'm not the originator of the term or the concept, so I'm just basically analyzing this concept of the well-being economy that others have come forward with, and which has gained some some considerable number of proponents around the world. So it's a phenomenon that's making some inroads, and so anyway, so it's not my term. I would imagine, if I'm putting myself into the shoes of maybe people who did come up with the term, the economy, I suppose, is seen as something central, something serious, something that you need rigorous thinking about, that governments must contend with. So I think there's an advantage to talking about an economy in that way, in terms of using that term economy and saying that we're actually getting at the heart of the serious issues that governments must deal with. But I also acknowledge that some of the points that have come up in the discussion, that it might be alienating for some other members of the public who for whom that term doesn't really resonate. So I think there may be, there's some pros and cons with the use of that word.
Thank you, Julia. The floor's yours, and I'm going to come back to Ralph and possibly Yannick in the last few minutes.
Thank you. Good to see you, Anders, and thanks for your talk and for pushing the envelope further on this idea of post-growth. My question is about whether the concept of post-growth is a bit more nuanced for those countries that we would call still, developing countries, or whose economies are even more growth dependent than the countries that we're all sitting in right now. Many of these countries, similar to the climate change argument and the kind of pushback you hear from developing countries on reducing emissions, when they're the ones who are least contributing to it, and yet need to actually develop more in terms of infrastructure, availability of services, enough to eat, in order to reach the kind of sufficiency that we're talking about. So to me, it comes back to the word sufficiency has a different meaning for wealthy developed countries that are over consuming than it does for other countries that are yet to really have a seat at the table. So I'm wondering how and if you think post-growth needs to be nuanced in that context.
I think you put it very well. I think I agree with basically exactly how you put that, in terms of it does have a different meaning, depending on whether countries in the global north or the global south, and the starting point, and so yeah, it definitely, and I wouldn't, I mean, I think the approach that I was talking about today is largely oriented towards the high income nations. Now, I think there's in the lower income nations, I think they have to pursue these issues in their own way and on their own terms. And of course, Bhutan's obviously been a real innovator in bringing some new thinking about what development means in the global south as well. So it's also about, I think the post-growth ideas can lead to a different approach to development in the global south, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that these countries don't need expanded material output and expanded material consumption. Now, I remember actually having some discussion with, I can't remember who it was in Bhutan about this very question about when does Bhutan reach the point of sufficiency? It clearly needs more production, more consumption, to reduce poverty. But what happens when you get to no longer a low-income country or move into the middle income status? At what point do you start to say, enough's enough? And remember getting an interesting response about saying that this was a really important question, but one that hadn't really been, fully figured out yet, even in the context in Bhutan. Anyway, this may be a long answer to say I agree with your formulation, and then these things definitely, ideas of post-growth definitely have to be nuanced according to development status.
Raymond Lurie, please. And Ralph, if you want to make your light point after Raymond has posed his intervention, we will turn to a thank you speaker. Raymond?
Okay, so my question builds on Julia's question. Essentially, I'm thinking about some of the things we've seen in the developed world, right, the less wealthy world, where we're seeing people going from, you take the example of the phones, right? They're not going through the landline phase, they're going straight to the cell phone phase. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about having some of those countries that are rapidly trying to catch up to us in making the same mistakes we've done on the overconsumption side? What are your thoughts about trying to drive them to a more a saner model of development that would emphasize well-being instead of consumption?
Yeah. Well, I think it's an interesting way to think about it in terms of, you touch on the sort of the technological leapfrogging, and maybe there could be some social leapfrogging as well, in terms of, skipping some of the maybe unfortunate elements of the development model that we pioneered here in the global north. So the one thing I'd be cautious about is, I do think this is, I think the best way is to model a different path rather than to sort of, push or constrain developing countries or countries in the global south from doing things in a particular way. So I think the best path is to to show change ourselves in terms of how we are organizing our own society, and also profiling and supporting those in the global south who are trying to model a different path. I don't think it's something that we can in any way impose on them, but it has to, I think we can model different practices and then support and encourage and give a higher profile to those in the global south that are moving in more of a well-being oriented direction.
Okay, so leverage examples like Costa Rica and others like you were talking before then to see how show a path forward that works better.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there are those examples that are emerging within the global south, and I think those showcasing those examples I think is important, and provide and doing what we can to provide examples of our own.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Ralph, would you like to make either a serious point or the light point that you made in the chat just now as our speaker from the floor?
Yeah. I wasn't looking for another opportunity, John, but my light point was that the WE acronym might be a bit of a problem in Canada in terms of getting the Trudeau government to buy in. But my more serious observation is that we're addicted. We become addicted to growth. Even after we recognize that it's no longer good for us, we seem to have a tremendous difficulty moving to a different way of thinking about how we get the things that we really need and value. And I think what Anders brings to the conversation, which is so badly needed, is a reminder that the things that we really care about are not the stuff that make up GDP, but it's comfort and health and self-realization and all of these fundamental human wants, which Herman Daly talks about as the ultimate ends, if you like, and which Peter Drucker and all the other deep thinkers on this subject have told us for a long time now are what we need to get back to thinking about if we are going to reframe the way that we are defining our path forward, so that we can start to see a future which looks so much more appealing than the dangers and costs of the present that we've created for ourselves, that we will overcome that addiction and move towards that future. And Anders, you contribute so much to helping that. I just wanted to, in advance of the more formal thank you for your presentation, just express my own appreciation for that contribution. And I hope that we can integrate the A into the ABC analysis. It's such a powerful term. It's not as subject to the rebound and the Jevons paradox stuff and all of that, which are problems with the B and the C terms. If we can reduce that A term, it just yields so many multiplying benefits all down the chain. So thanks again.
Thank you, Ralph. Before I invite Jean, I would like to point out to everybody on this call that glitches sometimes happen, quite rarely. But I also want to point out there are two CACOR members who are apps without whom these talks couldn't be arranged. There are backroom boys. We saw how a little glitch was overcome in short order. And so I want to acknowledge both Art Hunter and Dave Doherty for putting in well over an hour every week just to make this happen live. And then Art spends some time, and I think Dave as well, to put it on YouTube. So thank you, gentlemen. Wonderful. Please, Jean.
Yes, thank you, Anders. It is my distinct pleasure and privilege to be able to thank you on behalf of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome for a very, very important talk and discussion that you've initiated here, so that it gives us some idea of how we might try to approach getting out of the various crises that we face. There's a lot of inertial mass that's dragging us down, and I think this is a very thoughtful thing that we need to pursue. So thank you very much for that. And I would encourage you very strongly to go to our website, canadiancore.com. From there, you can look at and find the, on the Stay Informed button, you can get the link to all of the talks that we have had in the past, as well as information about how to look at and find Anders' talk that will be posted shortly. So all of the information that we have is available on our website. In addition to that, if you are interested in becoming a member there, and also once you get onto our YouTube site looking at various things, please subscribe to our YouTube, because it's very helpful for us in getting our word out. Thank you very much, Anders. This has been a very, very interesting and important talk. Okay, I think